This is the third video in the Depression chapter, and it is all about Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, if I have time. 1932, the country's in total collapse. The Dust Bowl has hit on the southern plains. There's a national drought. The election comes along. Herbert Hoover is running on the Republican ticket. Herbert Hoover's response to 1/4 of people being out of work and sometimes dying of hunger was that it's fine, prosperity is just around the corner, don't interfere, the economy will take care of itself. Some of this should sound familiar. The Republicans were really favoring big business, leave business alone, it will take care of it itself. Democrats had 3 candidates: Al Smith, the New York Irish Catholic, mayor of New York; John Nance Garner, who's our first national Texan on the national scene, a very competent politician from Texas; and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, New York governor. Garner, it was clear, was not going to win the nomination. He threw his support to Roosevelt. Roosevelt got the Democratic nomination, and John Nance Garner became vice president for 8 years. Roosevelt won in a landslide. 20 years later, Herbert Hoover was asked, what would you do different about the New Deal? And he said, I wouldn't change a thing. But something has to be done. The country is on the verge of collapse. The question, of course, is when our depression lasted longer and was much more serious than anything in Europe, how come European countries turned to fascism, European countries turned to communism, and America came out of the Depression as a democratic capitalist country? And there's one answer to that, and that is Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is the New Deal, and probably the most important man, not only in the 1930s, but also in all of the 1900s. Always counted one of the top 5 presidents in America after Washington and Lincoln. Like Teddy Roosevelt, often underestimated, people loved and hated him, but you cannot ignore Franklin Roosevelt. He is the main person in the 1930s and long after that. I mentioned that Teddy Roosevelt turned the country on a different tack. Franklin Roosevelt turned the country in a completely different direction. America is very different after Franklin Roosevelt. So who's Franklin Roosevelt? Like most of the Roosevelts, he is a very, very wealthy man. He was the 5th cousin of Teddy Roosevelt and really admired and tried to follow Teddy Roosevelt. He marries Teddy Roosevelt's niece, Eleanor, his brother's sister. Very wealthy father. And his mother also was independently wealthy. She had inherited money from her father, too. He is an only child, and I think this had a real psychological effect on him. Dad was in his 50s when he gets married. Mom was over 30 years younger. Dad died when he was in his teens. Mother lived forever into the 1940s. So wherever you see Franklin Roosevelt, you have to remember mom is in the background. And mom would definitely be called today a helicopter mom, no question about it. So Franklin Roosevelt is a very wealthy, pampered child. He has private tutors. He's never in a class with anybody until he's over 15 years old. He had his own pony. He had anything he wanted. When he finally went to Harvard for college, mom, being a helicopter mom, moved with him to Harvard. And this is every student's nightmare, but your mother moves to college with you, got an apartment off campus, and saw him on an almost daily basis. When he's finally married, and they married fairly young in their early 20s, her wedding present was an apartment in New York City for the young couple. She buys the apartment next door and had carpenters open a door, a connecting door in between the 2 apartments. You know, our instinctive reaction is, oh no, I don't know what Franklin thought about it. He never wrote about it. He's an average student, got a law degree, average accomplishments in college. He's not Teddy Roosevelt. This is not a genius intellect, but huge ambition, probably modeled after Teddy. Goes into New York politics because, like Teddy, the law wasn't very interesting. Becomes Secretary of the Navy, like Teddy Roosevelt. His career is rising. He is married to Eleanor. They have 5 children. And then his life collapses, just like Teddy Roosevelt, who lost his mother and his wife on the same day and took years getting back together. Franklin's Roosevelt, his turning point was polio. At the age of 39, 1921, he gets polio. Polio was the coronavirus of its time. It hit quickly. It was deadly. It didn't always kill you, but often killed children who didn't have the strength to fight it. There's no vaccine until 1954. So polio absolutely terrorized people. If you didn't die, you had a long recovery period, continuing pain, often partial paralysis or crippling for the rest of your life. Franklin Roosevelt goes to bed with a headache one night. He wakes up the next day. He's completely paralyzed. He spent 3 years in bed. Half of that time he couldn't move at all. Took him 3 years to recover completely, and he never did recover completely. From the waist down, his legs were partially paralyzed. He used a wheelchair a lot of the times. He could never walk unaided. He used leg braces, or he would have to lean on somebody. The amazing thing is, today, when we know everything about everybody, that the press and politicians and everybody in Washington, there was an unspoken pact never to mention polio. He was never shown in a wheelchair publicly. There are no photos, although the press was all over the place. There were no restrictions on it. Polio was never mentioned. He is always shown either in a car or behind something or with his sons supporting him. So there was a pact between government officials and the press never to show Roosevelt in a wheelchair, never to show him crippled, although he was for the rest of his life. Why? Because it was a sign of weakness. And in the Depression, people would not relate to a weak president, and certainly not in World War II. So amazingly enough, everybody agreed to this. There's no legal papers they signed, but he was never shown publicly with any kind of crippling pictures. We've come a long way. Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, is in a wheelchair permanently, and he's shown all the time in a wheelchair. But at the time in the 1930s, this was a sign of weakness, and it was never shown. Horrible thing for Roosevelt, great thing for the country. How did it change Roosevelt? Changed his personality completely. It gave him two things. First of all, it gave him empathy. He understood what suffering was like. He understood a little bit of what poor people were going through. Again, my thing is, if you're a very wealthy person and you're a politician, how do you know what average people's lives are? Polio did that for Roosevelt. He became less arrogant. He became more dedicated to his job. He became more serious. An indication of this were two of his employees later on in the White House. He had a personal valet that took care of his clothes and his possessions, and the guy was a drunk. And people told him, get rid of this guy, fire him. And he said, I can't do that. He never fired him. It's the Depression. He'll never get another job. He also had a cook in the White House who refused to make what Roosevelt wanted. When he would ask for a certain dish, the cook said, no, I'm not making that. I'm making what I feel like making. You're the president. You want a peanut butter sandwich, you should be able to get a peanut butter sandwich. Again, they told Roosevelt, fire this guy. And he said, I can't do it. It's the middle of the Depression. He'll be unemployed. He has a family. The other thing that it changed Roosevelt is it made him incredibly optimistic. And again, you have that Roosevelt ear-to-ear grin. There's very few pictures before World War II that show Roosevelt where he is not smiling. Why? I'm quoting Roosevelt. If you spend 3 years in bed trying to wiggle your toes, anything else seems easy. So if he has conquered polio, he felt there's nothing else he could not conquer. And if he didn't know how to do it, he'd find somebody who did. He returns to politics in 1928. He's elected New Jersey governor, in which he passed welfare legislation, relief for the unemployed, and he runs for president after getting polio. He was elected 4 times, did not finish his 4th term. He died, but he's elected 4 times, the only president to be elected more than twice. Okay, personality-wise, Franklin Roosevelt, energetic, charming. Again, he's hiding some stuff underneath. A great voice, great public speaker, very good with media. The media of the time is radio. He's an experienced politician. He was a good speaker and used very well media, used radio very, very well. Complete confidence. Never lost any sleep over the Great Depression. Eleanor said later, I never heard him say there was a problem impossible for human beings to solve. When he did not know the answer, he was completely confident there was an answer, and he would find it himself or get it from somebody else. So his attitude towards the Great Depression is, of course, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. We can do this. And this is what the country needs to hear in the middle of an economic disaster. Not things will be fine, prosperity is just around the corner, but we can fix this. He surrounds himself with what was called the Brains Trust of college professors and all kinds of people, blacks, women's, Catholic, Jews. In fact, so many Jewish academics around Franklin Roosevelt that the New Deal was called by many people sarcastically the Jew deal. Unlike Republicans, who only talked to businessmen and favored business, Franklin Roosevelt talked to everybody. Why? He wanted ideas. You don't have any answers? Get me some more experts, come up with some answers, and I will try anything. Absolutely pragmatic, absolutely practical. Not a great thinker like Teddy Roosevelt, but a problem solver. I will do anything. I will try anything. Another politician at the time said of Roosevelt, if he burned down the Capitol, people would say, at least he got a fire started. Things are desperate in 1932. And if you look at the end of the Roosevelt section, there's two great political cartoons. Slides number 33 and 34. Again, grinning ear to ear Roosevelt and all of his babies, the different parts of the New Deal. I don't think I'm going to make a home run every time, but I'm going to hit with some of them. Take a method and try it. If it fails, try another. But above all, try something. Get this fixed. Okay, and I'm pretty much out of time, so I'll try and do Eleanor on the next one. Thanks a lot, and please stay safe.